The next, I want to switch the order of the next two items. Rather than hearing from Dina with the compliance director update, I'm going to ask Bob to educate us. So, Bob.
Beautiful.
Yeah, Dina and
Ms. Mount.
Larry and Dina, please join Bob there for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been asked to provide a 45-minute presentation. It'll be shorter than that. Oh, well, it depends on you, doesn't it? It'll be as long as you want it to be, won't it? Yeah. Yes, yep. Sitting next to me is Dina Mount, who, of course, you know. Dina is in charge of the compliance effort ongoing at CalSTRS, and it is my pleasure to provide a brief presentation. And if it seems simple, it's by design. I wanted to really take a step back and start sort of at ground zero about what compliance is and how it differs from an internal audits. And what I'm really hoping is that you have some questions for us, and that I can answer the questions if it's sort of the Zen of compliance, and if it's related to how compliance is going to work at CalSTRS, then that would be Ms. Mount's responsibility. So we'll sort of work together to work through these. But before I start, I would also like to say something about Robin. Robin, I will miss your competence. Holy cow. The only saving grace that kept me, that allowed me to sleep that night that I was told you were leaving, and you told me, was that you're leaving an amazing staff who is well-trained and very competent. Nonetheless, the leadership vacuum and your competence I will miss. So thank you. All right. The green button goes. My name is Bob. Stop me if you've got any questions. So if you think of compliance before, so let's go way back, take a step even further back. Why deal with compliance at all? Why is this brought to you? What's your role? I think of it as risk mitigation. That's the broad umbrella that this really falls under. So boards are not responsible. You are responsible for overseeing the process and controls that reduce risk to acceptable levels. You can't get rid of it. You can't live in a world without it. But it is your responsibility to be informed of the risks that are available and have oversight responsibility of it. I'm not just going to read slides. So if you want me to read slides, find someone else. Management is responsible for designing, implementing, and testing those systems. Your responsibility is to come to an understanding of whether management's processes are sufficient and satisfactory. And you have many people that help you with that, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. Questions so far? The basis is risk. Not all risk can be eliminated. There are some, as Ms. Mount will, in actually the presentation she provided, there are most certainly some risks that just there's no tolerance for it or appetite for it whatsoever. But most can't be eliminated at all. So the issue is, if it's a risk that we know we're going to be exposed to, how do we reduce that to a level that doesn't hurt us if it happens? Can we reduce the probability of that risky event from occurring? And some risks are just external to the organization. You really don't have a lot of control of it, except maybe through legislation. So what do? If you can't reduce that risk, we mitigate it. So if there's two things you walk away with today, risk reduction or mitigation, and in my mind, those are different. And so everything that you're going to see in a compliance function is working towards one of those two goals, sometimes jointly, but sometimes separately. If the risk is present and you can reduce the probability of it, then that reduces the effect if it occurs. Sometimes you can't stop the risk from happening because it's just out of your hands. So there you try to mitigate it. Maybe put in other things that if that risk occurs, because it's going to happen because you don't have a control over it, it reduces the effect to the organization. I call that mitigation. Mitigation and reduction. That won't make it go forward, will it? So when we start thinking about what risks can a compliance function address, and I guess in theory you could address them all. Yeah.
Harry would
I feel like I'm in the classroom and I actually want to engage.
I want to stand up and walk around right now. Yeah.
I want to engage with my, actually, literally, I feel like that. I want to engage with my professor on reduction, mitigation.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a price to that.
Yep.
So at what point do you decide, there's a cost to reduce that risk? at what point do you say, yeah, it's too much time or too much, some form of resources? Does that when you go from reduction to or what's the transition there?
Right, so you're talking
At
about a
some point, you
larger,
have to make a decision. You're gonna take some action of human capital or financial capital to
Yep.
reduce a risk in an organization. At what point, and this is probably not appropriate to discuss here with you like this.
oh, sure it is.
Is it?
Yeah,
Okay, so how do you make that determination?
I don't, you do.
Right, oh, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm passing the buck.
So then we look to our chairman to help us.
You guys, right there.
Certainly part of the role.
But you guide us. You advise us.
Absolutely, as well as Ms. Mount.
Yeah.
As well as Mr. Jensen, as well as your chief financial officer.
Sure, all of those. Right.
That's right.
Of course.
But ultimately, it does fall on
All
the
on
board
us.
to decide which risks are acceptable.
Yeah.
And as Ms. Mount, through the educational process over time, and maybe even a little bit today, I'm not sure, we'll discuss a risk tolerance and a risk appetite, and
Which is, also, it makes it even more complicated because Mr. Rosensteel's risk tolerance for a certain matter might be different than mine.
of course.
And then how do we collectively as a group, say as a organization, that we want some actions to be taken? So it's
Right. So practically speaking.
it's interesting.
But practically speaking, how that'll shake out, Mr. Keeley, is you'll have the management staff, Ms. Mount, her staff, working in the organization, will bring forward some recommendations for the board to consider. And the board will consider those recommendations, much like Mr. Jensen brings forth his audit plan. This is how many audits I plan to do. These are the ones we plan to audit. What do you think? And based on his expertise, you ask him questions. Are we doing the right one at the right time? Is there sufficient coverage? What's the coverage? And then you ask him, do you think we're doing the right amount? And he'll say, well, given the resources we have, this is where we are. This is what our coverage is. And you come to an acceptance. So you won't be left hanging out there alone to make it on your own. You'll be brought some.
And I think, as my own evolution as a member of the board, I almost look at everything now through risk. That one of my overarching responsibilities as a trustee is to understand the risks that are associated. It's like everything we do has a risk component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there are, it's interesting to look at it that way. I
Absolutely.
mean, all of those discussions we had yesterday were centered around risk and how do you manage that risk?
That's right.
What are the trade-offs?
That's right.
What's my tolerance? What's someone else's tolerance? How do we collectively come to a consensus or an agreement of what the right approach is?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, as the compliance program, and I'll talk about this, as this compliance program builds out, it will start in a smaller space, right? The risks that will be considered will be in a smaller space, and then it will mature as it grows. The staffing right now is pretty lean. I'm sitting next to, I think, 50% of the compliance staff, give or take. 75, thank you. Thank you. So, well, but at the moment, let me go. So strategic risk are those external to the organization, right? So there may be changes in pension laws, changes in rules. The best you can do here is mitigate it or perhaps seek some legislation. Then there are external operating risks. So there's three kinds: strategic, external operating, and internal operating. The external operating are investment returns. Do you have control over the markets? You really don't. Retiree longevity. People might start working out a lot and they might live longer, inflation rates. So you can mitigate these, of course, and there are processes there. The kind that I want to spend most of my time thinking about are what I call internal operational risks. Non-compliance with the existing rules, laws, policies, and procedures of the organization, either imposed by external parties, the state and federal government, or imposed internally, some investment guidelines based on your beliefs. So that here you can, in fact, reduce the probability of the risky event or mitigate some of those effects. Many compliance programs just focus on this. Some try to expand it to the other risks as well. As you were saying, Mr. Keeley, the risk is surrounding and around us, right? My initial advice would be, holy cow, that's an awful lot to bite off at the beginning. So maybe one really solid place to start is what I'll call internal operating risk. So let's start with the 3 lines of defense. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is really fun for an accountant like me to talk about. When I look within an organization and think, how are we going to mitigate that risk? What are the lines of defense? Where are the trenches going to be drawn? And modern thinking on risk management, enterprise risk management, devised 3 lines. The first one is just the day-to-day operational management activities. Now, later in the presentation, I'm going to have some concrete examples of this, really down-in-the-weed examples so that it resonates home. But just for now, think of the first line as the individual employee sitting behind a desk, doing their daily activities, and they might not even know that there's a compliance element involved with it. It's almost transparent if it's done well. Second is risk management and compliance. Now, this is where Ms. Mount and her shop would show up, and it's not where Larry shows up, but it is where she would show up. She would be part of the second line of defense. What's the third line of defense? Independent audit verification. So lines 1 and lines 2 are not independent of management. Lines 1 and 2 are part of management. They're part of the organization. I would not, in my opinion, look for independence in either of those. They need to be non-independent of management if it's going to function highly. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's my opinion. Now, the third one is Larry, as well as the external auditors who you saw present earlier. They are independent, internal and external to the organization. Are there any questions on the 3 lines of defense? Basic employees right there doing activities day to day. They're the first line because they're the closest, right? They're the closest to the risk. Second line, a compliance program that categorizes and oversees risk from a broader perspective. And third, Larry coming in and doing an audit, and the auditors coming in and doing an audit. So one difference pops up right now, which is internal compliance is part of management. Does compliance get audited, just like benefits and services would get audited? Yep. Compliance becomes an auditable entity on Larry's risk assessment. So there's, right, I think that makes it really clear the difference between the two. We good? Talking too fast? It's what I do.
Can I ask one question there?
Of course you can.
Who audits Larry?
Yeah, no, that's great. So Larry does get audited. According to standards, he would be audited every 3 to 5 years, Yellow Book, Red Book, and that's called a Quality Assurance Review, or a QAR for short. These are external auditors who come in and audit your internal audit function. This, I don't know when your next one's up, a couple years?
We just presented one to the ARM committee in 2016. We had KPMG come in and they thoroughly looked at our work. And so it's kind of, you're right, who audits the auditors, right? And that's.
Close the loop on that. Make
Yep.
Sure
Yep.
And then just to tie it real quick, Crow gets audited as well. They go through an external review on a periodic basis as well. So we like to audit each other. Brian, my guess is you do.
I was wondering if someone was going to ask that question.
One thing that I think is important to note with a compliance function is that I would not be in a hurry if I were in the board's shoes to draw boxes around it too early and say this is what it should be limited to. So for example, one thought is, well, compliance could be limited to laws that are written down at the state level or the federal level, and that's it. I want to limit your activities to this. Although ultimately it may move in that direction, or the efforts may move in that direction, I don't think it's a good idea initially to draw a box around the risks that compliance would consider. Now, I would say a good start would be the operational risks, which are the policies, procedures, laws, and regulations, internal and external to the organization. That's a good place to start to form a limit. And what you'll do is a risk assessment, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. And that risk assessment will be a lot like the auditor does. What are the universe of risks, compliance risks that the organization could face? And how costly are they if those risks come to fruition? And that can help define the scope of the compliance activities. So you say, what's out there? How dangerous could it be? How much could it hurt? And let's focus on those that could hurt the most. So I think that's one way to winnow it down, as opposed to predefining it in advance. Good? Some differences. As I said, internal audits is independent. Compliance does not have to be, and my suggestion is that it would not be. Audits examines the internal control environment, which includes compliance efforts. Compliance efforts are now embedded within and become part of that control environment. Some more differences. Compliance should be embedded almost invisibly right into the fabric of the organization. Audits is not embedded. In fact, it should not be embedded. It should be independent, and they can't, as you heard the discussion, great questions with Vargas, right? The first, when you brought up, how can you help us benchmark the implementation results of the system, and what can an auditor do and not do? You heard the first thing they jumped right on is, oh golly, we want to make sure we remain independent. And that's exactly the spirit with which an auditor brings to the table. Compliance brings a little bit of a different spirit. The spirit compliance would bring is, how can I help you? What can I do working with you, us together, to help design a strong system that is cost-effective and efficient at achieving the results and mitigating the risks? They can help design that. So that's an important difference to see. Audits have to follow a very specific set of standards, what reports they give and when they give them and how they do it. So this tongue firmly in cheek with this slide. So when a compliance officer like Dina walks into the room, she's there to help you achieve what you already want to do, a spirit of compliance within the organization. If you as a board pass a policy or procedure or there's an external law or regulation, the organization as a whole really does want to comply with that. Just sometimes they're not exactly sure how to do it in a cost-effective way. Well, that's the role of compliance. You see, Ms. Mount walks in and says, what can I do to help you achieve that goal? How can we do it together? That's not Mr. Jensen's role. Mr. Jensen cannot help design those activities. His obligation is to come in after the fact and audit the effectiveness of those activities. Now, actually, people are happy to see Larry. He's wonderful, I know.
I just want to clarify, big A stands for audit services, right? Just make sure we're all on the same page with that. Okay.
What are some similarities? So we see some big differences. Where are they alike? They both assist in you, the board, and the organization in reducing and mitigating risk that you would otherwise be exposed to. They both use a risk assessment as the basis of their work. They look at the universe of possible risks that exist, form an assessment, weighting those risks according to which ones could hurt the most if they happen. And then, Mr. Keeley, that last bullet right there, always, always, always keeping in mind the cost-benefit principle. Resources are expensive. And neither audits nor compliance should be the tail that wags the dog. The dog is securing the fund for the future of the teachers, in my humble opinion. And they both carefully document their processes and procedures. And they both report to the ARM committee. In my opinion, it is proper and would be a really great idea for Ms. Mount to report to you in the same way that you've become accustomed to Mr. Jensen reporting to you. So as you've noticed on every meeting, the 4 times a year, Mr. Jensen has what's called his auditor's update, which he just gave you. It's an informal opportunity to discuss with you what's going on, where things have been. It's not the formal, here's a report, let's chew on this, let's see where the deficiencies are. It's more an opportunity to engage you on what is upcoming, what he's done, and give you a chance to talk with him about this. I believe that at every meeting, Ms. Mount should have the identical opportunity. In fact, there should be an expectation that you'll get 2 updates. You'll get an update from your chief auditor, and you'll get an update from your chief compliance, in my opinion. And that there be, compliance is the new kid on the block, right? She doesn't have the time in service that Mr. Jensen has. She hasn't had the opportunity to gain the trust of the board, hasn't had the opportunity to learn the organization, to produce the reports and work with everyone. And so whenever there's a new kid on the block, there's always sort of unfamiliarity, always some, all right, what are you going to do? And are you going to add to my workload? And I think it's important, in my opinion, to recognize that she's here. Compliance is valuable. Compliance is important. And from your perspective, in terms of how they can help you achieve your goal of risk mitigation, they're equal, in my eyes.
Bob, before you go on, can I ask a question on, so when we get a report from Larry, it usually includes some suggestions about how to correct the deficiency, the problem that his staff has identified. So is that, what happens with that? I mean, is that something that then goes to Dina to work with the staff with, or I'm trying to understand how much of that is Larry's responsibility, because you kind of said, well, Larry's responsibility is to make sure things, to audit whether things, policies and procedures and laws were complied with, but whose responsibility is it to figure out the corrective action and take the corrective action? And how do audits and compliance work together, or what are their roles in that?
Right, that's an excellent question. In fact, I have 2 slides on it,
Oh, okay.
but I'm not to them yet. And when I get there, may I do it when I get there?
That's fine, we can delay it until you get there.
So a term of culture of compliance is really critical. So as I said, there's a lot of policies and procedures that the organization has adopted. Many the board has adopted, some are external. The organization wants to comply. Everyone, when they come to work that day, they don't sit down and say, gee, I'm going to think about how I can not comply today. In fact, the opposite is true. Everyone in the organization wants to comply with the policies and procedures. Just sometimes they don't know what they are. Sometimes it's hard to do. But the culture of compliance needs to be deeply embedded within the organization, I believe. And who are those that are in the best position to identify the risk? Those that are right on that risk on a day-to-day basis, those that are closest to it. So that's why I think compliance should not be independent of management. Because if someone is going to be useful in helping a compliance system identify where those risks are, they need to feel comfortable that they're working on the same team with respect to achieving that goal of culture of compliance. Who owns compliance? Everyone needs to own compliance. Not everyone in the organization is an auditor. If I were to ask the staff sitting behind me, do you think you're an auditor? The answer would probably be no for most of them, and the second thing is they would say, and thank God. But if I ask them, oh, look, I'm an auditor too, Larry. If I were to ask anyone on staff, are you compliance? Are you part of the compliance program in the organization? I would like that answer to be yes from each and every employee, no matter who they are. From the person who sits at the front gate, letting you in, to everyone within the organization. Everyone plays a little piece of that compliance role. It's deeply embedded and owned within the organization. So one thing that's vital, although Dina is new, and Brian's efforts with bringing forth a compliance system, and he is to be greatly thanked for championing that in his own I will not give up way. But nonetheless, it is true that compliance itself is not new to CalSTRS. There are already many, many compliance functions laced within the organization, and they've been here for years. So you're not without compliance. What you are without is an oversight mechanism to help categorize, to document, to assist, to look at the evenness across the entire organization and see where the compliance gaps are. That's what has not been present in the past. But compliance activities have been ongoing, and I'll mention some very specific ones here in a few minutes. And I just said that. What's lacking is a formal oversight and mechanism. So here's a quote that I wasn't going to attribute to your CFO, but I'm going to because I like it so much that I can't own it. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. Now that's not completely true, and Robin and I both know that. But as an auditor, as a compliance person, as an accountant, documentation is a critical part of the compliance function. And you see that's important because that'll be brought to you. See that, Mr. Keeley? It'll be documented, it'll be brought to you, and that will provide a basis to help you make your decision of what risks are worth bearing, how much cost should we throw at something, how much we just decide it's not worth it. So the documentation, quite frankly, is strong in some mature areas within the organization, and in others, it's, shall we say, less complete, would be charitable. What can a compliance do for you? As I just said, it can assist you in your obligations to oversee risk within the organization. It can look for holes. where are compliance holes, and it can also look for double counting. Are there places where two people within the organization in two different silos are complying with the same compliance risk, and they didn't know it because nobody was really looking at it that way? So there actually may be some opportunities for savings, possibly. It ensures an evenness across the units. So right now, I would say compliance across the business units is very uneven. And a formal compliance system can sort of bring everyone up to the same level of excellence, if you will. It ensures documentation, and it gives staff a valuable resource. As I said, the primary role of Ms. Mount is to assist the organization in doing what they already want to do. She's the momentum that helps build the momentum behind the compliance effort within the organization. She walks in a room, you say, oh my God, thankfully someone's here to help us embed compliance deeply into the organization. So here's a really simple example. So I came in a couple weeks ago to talk to many staff about compliance and spent a day here. It was wonderful. But when I walked in the building, I needed to go up the stairs. To get up those stairs, you have to go through some thing or it's going to beep very loudly at you. So my guess is that there is somewhere some documentation that says the building should have some physical limitations in terms of who can get in. All right, great, there's a rule, there's a policy. How do you comply with it, and how do you know? So the guard behind the desk, they were very competent. They asked for my ID. They wanted my driver's license. They looked at the picture. Yep, that's you. You could have taken a better picture, but that's you. Then they took like some photocopy of it to document that that was taken. There's an electronic register. But even more than that, they made me sign a piece of paper. What time did you come in? So there's documentation that can be gone to look back at it and say, yep, we completed this. Now, did that guard know that they were part of a compliance project? Probably not. That's their job. Do you see the difference? My job is to do these activities, and those activities were transparently compliance, to achieve a compliance objective. So that's just a really sort of simple baby steps example. But let me give you a more comprehensive example. And Mr. Rosensteel, this will start to get to your point. And I'd like to thank Larry for providing this example. So if I mess it up, can you help me here? Okay. Back in 2012, the external auditor, Crowe Horwath, identified a material weakness, and it was with controls over member data. You may recall that this was there. Now, member data, as you know, much of it is not internally generated. It's supplied by the school districts. And so the accuracy of the information that you're processing is based on the accuracy of the information given to you by the school districts. Now, the school districts want to provide you with accurate information. I believe that. But sometimes it's hard to do that. In particular, employers can do things called edits. We call edits, which means you can reach into the data and make some changes. There's lots of reasons you would want to reach into the data and make a change. But the problem was that the auditors could not assure themselves that CalSTRS was in a position to have good control over those edits, to have supporting documentation as to why they were made, and then within CalSTRS, how did you systematically review the employer edits to see why they were made, were they right, were they wrong? So there was two sets of documentation sort of missing, if you will. Why did you do this, Mr. School District? And second, how did we respond to that by looking at those edits? So the auditors identified this, right? This came externally. So this is where compliance came in. Compliance, which is the second line, Ms. Mount's office, was asked to come in to member account services, which is the first line, that base level, and say, what can I do to help you? And they asked her, she said, I'm here to help. What can I do? So the first step was to identify the universe of the risks, right? Look at all the edits that could happen. What are all the types of edits? And it turns out there's a lot of types of edits. Assign a risk to each of those edits. Which ones, at the end of the day, would really move the needle in terms of being costly to the organization if the edit was done incorrectly? Identifying the most significant ones through a risk assessment. And then management embedded specific steps to take the highest risks and try to mitigate them. So for example, some specific things that we've done, that you've done, request employers to review and confirm all edits. If you're going to make an edit and edits are inevitable, that's fine. but we want you to review and confirm to us that you've looked at them and provide a basis for those. There's now a formal process within CalSTRS to review the highest risk edits. Not every edit, because it would simply take too long and probably not worth the effort. But there is a formal program in place to look at the higher risk ones, and then you document it. Here's what this particular type of edit. We think that's a high risk one. We looked at it, and I've documented it. I've looked at it this day by this person, and here's the outcome. Now, here's the feedback. That goes back to Audit Services, which is Mr. Jensen. They informed Audit Services of the compliance risk assessment. Hey, here's what we did. We identified the edits. We did a risk assessment. Here are the risky ones. Here are the ones we're going to look at, and here's what we're going to do. Then Chief Auditor puts that on his audit plan and says, all right, you say you're going to look at those risks, the biggest ones, and you're going to document them? Fine. In a little bit, I'm going to knock on your door, and I'm going to audit that. And I'm going to see if you're doing what you say you do. See, do you see the feedback there? So I think, how long did you give him, Larry? He gave him 4 months. You've got 4 months to put this in place, get it working, let's see how it goes, and then I'm going to knock on your door. And we're going to do a little audit to see if your procedures are functioning. And then, of course, those results of that audit will be brought to you, to the board. Whoops, that was backwards. Then the results of that audit, you see, are available to Ms. Mount. So Ms. Mount can take the results of the audit on the compliance procedures and go back and revisit them and say, hey, we intended to find all these edits. It looks like there was one edit that got left off the table. What can we do to not lose that edit anymore? So there absolutely is a feedback. It's a circle. It goes round, but it goes both ways. So, but before I get to those slides, I know the board has had some questions early on about what does a compliance program do? What can it do for us? How does it get started? How do you start one? And I think Ms. Mount has done a very good effort in this way. But just to go back to what, again, this is not the first time that that a compliance risk assessment's ever been done in the universe. And it's not the first time, but it will be the first time that it's done within this organization. But I do have to say, I've spent significant time now with Ms. Mount talking about her thoughts on how this could be done and should be done, as well as Mr. Jensen, as well as Chief Legal and Chief Financial and Chief Investments. I've talked with all these individuals. And I will say that Ms. Mount has my complete confidence. She is more than capable of developing this process. She's gonna need some patience on behalf of everyone as it rolls out a new compliance program in a new organization for her. So I think a modicum of patience is needed, but she has my every confidence. I have no doubt that it will get there. Just let's give it some time. Larry's been doing his thing here for quite some time. And look, do you remember the time when Larry showed up? Things have systematically gotten better and stronger every single year that he's been here. The staff is vastly improved. The reports are clean and crisp. The audits are getting done on a more frequent basis. Things have just got better. And so as an organization, sometimes you can expect that level of competence right out of the gate. Well, it doesn't always work that way. So my suggestion is let's give this a chance to blossom and grow. There's lots of ways to identify the risks. There's lots of ways to get help doing this. So I have a simple recommendation that may be powerful. And I've, as I said, I've talked with all those officers and Ms. Mount as well. There is currently a committee at CalSTRS that works with compliance and gives each of the business units opportunity to meet with Ms. Mount to discuss how compliance will function. And I think every business unit's represented, right? Now, this committee is the way that compliance can interact with the entire business unit format of the organization. That's great. I'm happy that that committee's there. But I think we need something else that's not there right now. I think we need, and I don't know what to call it. Let's call it a steering committee. Let's call it a gang of three. I don't care. No, don't call it that. It's a group of individuals within the organization who work in pre-existing mature compliance efforts. So for example, investments has a fairly well-established and well-running compliance effort. It's called ICER. Is that an acronym that is familiar to most of the board? So I'll work through it. IC, ER, investment compliance, ethics, and reporting. And this is in the hands and leadership of Deborah, who usually sits right there. She's always there. And with a capable hand, and she delegates many of those activities to another person I'd like to introduce you to. Her name is Melissa, and I'm going to say your last name wrong all the time. Duranda. Yeah, Duranco. And here's Ms. Duranco. So she is essentially, she is in charge of the ICER function within the investments branch. And their job is exactly that, compliance with the rules and regulations that the state and the federal government impose, as well as you as the board impose from investment on them. And then ethics, reporting, the Form 700, and then documenting, right? Documenting this and bringing it to the board. So this is a highly functioning, high-quality compliance organization already embedded within the organization. Gosh, what an opportunity to take that knowledge and assist Ms. Mount in bringing that to the organization as a whole. And so who else could be on this steering committee, let's call it? I don't think it should be representation from all the business units. That's not what this is. That's the other committee that's already there. This is really intended to assist Ms. Mount in rolling out a highly successful compliance unit using those who already have mature compliance functions within the organization. So I'm not going to pretend to know who that is. Financial services come to mind. Clearly, investments comes to mind. And really, it's up to Ms. Mount to choose her team, right? And then, of course, the chief auditor would be, it would be remiss to not have him as an advisor. Should he be on the committee? Maybe yeah, maybe no. An advisor? Absolutely, at a minimum. And again, I would put this in Ms. Mount's hands, but I would recommend that committee be formed to draw on the talents of compliance that already exist within. That makes sense? You okay with that? All right, she didn't kick me under the table, so I guess I'm good so far. I'm going to skip that because I kind of already talked about that. Oh, here we go, Mr. Chair. So audits do feed compliance. Internal and external audit do audits. They come up with a bunch of findings, weaknesses, significant deficiencies, or just deficiencies. These provide an opportunity for compliance effort to look at these reports and say, all right, if they found a deficiency, there must not be, the compliance must have broken down at that business unit level. What can I do now to go visit that business unit level and help them institute an internal control and compliance system that patches that hole? You see, the chief auditor can help and he can advise, but his folks can't go down there and help you design that control because then he can't come behind and audit his own control. You see, but Ms. Mount can. She can go down there, and those audit reports are valuable to her in helping her identify where some of the holes might be. So then internal audits performs an independent assessment of the risk mitigation activities that Ms. Mount puts in place. The results of those go back to compliance. So it's a circle. And then it goes the other way. Compliance can feed audits. So let's say that there's a particular control that did not rise to the level of showing up on the audit plan for a particular year, right? You know that Mr. Jensen does an audit plan, risks it, scopes it out, and doesn't audit everything every year. Nor should he, because you make a reasonable cost-benefit choice. But let's say that Ms. Mount is down working with a unit on compliance and she finds something. Let's say that, gosh, you know, it looks like there was a compliance hole here. I'm going to help you fix this. But now she has a responsibility to go to the chief auditor and say, hey, Larry, I know this isn't on your audit screen for this year or even next year. But you know, when I was down in this unit helping them with their compliance, I found something you may want to look at, and you might want to consider putting this on your audit plan, maybe moving it up a little bit, maybe doing it sooner, or maybe doing it that was there. So audits can feed what compliance looks at, and compliance can feed what audits looks at. Neither work in a vacuum, and that's why I believe when they both should report to you, they both should be giving reports to you pretty much at every meeting kind of at the same time, because they really are sort of, they work hand in hand. What's your role? Well, I told you, I think they should report to you. I think she should be right up here with Larry. They are equal. And I'm going to quit with some suggestions and thoughts. So I think the best thought I have is that steering committee or that steering group that Ms. Mount can pull on to use their expertise to establish the compliance program here. I think initially, you should not limit the scope of the compliance program artificially, but instead let the compliance risks flow from a compliance assessment and waiting on those risks. And that compliance assessment is already underway. I mean, there is one. In my opinion, as I said before, I believe Ms. Mount has the experience and demeanor. Demeanor is especially important for auditors and for compliance directors, because Mr. Jensen's wonderful with his demeanor. He's very professional, very competent. I'm not here to get you. I'm here to perform an audit to help the board assess their oversight role. And compliance also needs a good demeanor who goes in and says, yes, my role is compliance, but I'm here to help you comply with what you already want to comply with. And I believe she has both the talent and the demeanor. I think now is a good time to lay a solid foundation for compliance. It's been exposed to the board several times. You've received several presentations on what compliance is or what it's not. Not all of those have been satisfactory to you. I get that. They haven't all been to me. And so I think now's a really good time to take a step back and say, how can we roll this out in a way that makes sense and that is the best for the organization? It's my opinion that compliance leads the initiation and operation of the compliance effort, that compliance is in charge of compliance. And not that they haven't been, but I just want to make crystal clear that they, in my opinion, they need to be. This needs to be owned by Ms. Mount, and it's a challenge, but I think this is your job. And finally, right now it's a nascent effort within the organization, and staffing is small. Now, remember, there are already people doing compliance. For example, with ICER, there's several people working in compliance. So I'm not saying hire more people to do compliance. That's not what I'm suggesting. That's someone else's suggestion to make. I'm saying I believe Ms. Mount needs help, and I believe that she needs it rather quickly to help her roll out an effective compliance system. I believe that she does simply not have the adequate resources right now to get it off the ground in a way that's competent and that meets the needs. It's way out of my pay grade to say how many people and how soon, except that, gosh, at least one person, and gosh, at least right away. That would just be my humble opinion. And so I know that things have gone on long. I tried to be as efficient as I could, but do you have any questions that Ms. Mount and I could answer for you?
Lynn.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the presentation. It was very thought-provoking, and I appreciate your describing to us how you see compliance and auditing working with each other. And I think in the presentation, one place it says that compliance would be subject to audit. Is that correct? Internal audit?
That is absolutely correct.
So would the audit team also be subject to a review by the compliance team?
No. Well,
Not from the same perspective.
Right.
With regards to conducting an audit. However, as part of the risk assessment that was described that's ongoing, Ms. Mount already has reviewed kind of our policies and procedures that we follow, making sure that we had our quality assurance review, that it was performed as we're required, and how do we ensure that we meet, our standards that we're supposed to follow. And so as part of that risk assessment process, yeah, she's already been looking at us. And then, but from an audit perspective where, she's providing and working with management, and she's helping management to accomplish their objectives. And my role is assurance to you and executive management that things are functioning as intended. And so over time, as the compliance program continues to mature and grow, there's going to be a point where we're going to come in and conduct an audit of the work that they perform in achievement of their performance objectives. Okay. This year on the plan, for example, we have enterprise risk management program, and now that's been around and in place for a few years. So we'll take best practices, we'll do some comparisons, we'll do some audit work of their processes, and then provide assurance to you that it's functioning as outlined and as intended in the organization.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And then Ms. Mount, I have a question for you, and clearly, Dr. Yetman was very firm in his belief that you needed more resources at this point, and just curious what you were thinking in terms of resources.
So I did submit a 4-year resource staffing plan that, as needed, if needed, builds on from today as the program builds and develops. If it reaches all of its goals and objectives over a 4-year period, would be 10 staff. And it's 2 specific units within compliance. One is policy management unit. The other is compliance monitoring unit. So those 2 units to be fully staffed and to have a supervisor to manage the administrative part of timesheets and all that kind of stuff, it builds out to 10 people total. But we did it over a 4-year rollout, and so I think that for this year, we've asked for 1 or 2 for this year, and then 2 or 3 more next year, and as needed, if needed, to build to help the program grow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And so let's see, Joy. I'll let Joy go, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay. Thank you. So, I really appreciate the presentation as well as the conversations that you've been able to have with Dina and Larry and the others. And I think what I have struggled with as we, even Dina, before you joined our organization and working with these issues, through these issues with Brian, is just sort of how exactly we bring structure to it and how we get our arms around it. Because as you've pointed out, Bob, CalSTRS isn't a new organization. We clearly are engaged in compliance activities throughout the organization, and it's just sort of this concept of Dina being brought in to be our the sort of leader to put a formal program together that builds on what we're already doing, fills in gaps where they're needed, and is able to then report to us. And I think it's just, we've all struggled a little bit with how we define that, how we, put pen to paper and define what the program will do. It's especially given the fact that Dina's a one-woman operation right now, and there's so much conceivably that could be done. So, I think I'd like to just hear more, and, not today necessarily, but know that you'll come back to us with more ideas, especially as you potentially work with the steering committee, work with the gang of 3. I don't know what other word to use either, but to sort of, build out the program. I will say that I've kind of come into this thinking that if we're going to start somewhere, we want to start with the focus on compliance with laws and regulations. And I think, Bob, you've pointed out that we may want to think, be more expansive at least to start, and look at what our highest risks are. And then, again, it doesn't mean that we'd only focus on the top 3 or 5 or 10, but we look at what those are and what our risk tolerance is, and then figure out how we build that over the 1 year, 2 years, 4 years. This was helpful to me. I look forward to working, with all of you as we're developing the program. And I just wanted to particularly kind of endorse the comments that you made about demeanor, both with Larry and with Dina, because I think that is, it's not necessarily it's something that's hard to describe, but you sort of know it when you see it, and you know what you're looking for. And I haven't had a chance to work with Dina very much yet, just really in our committee settings. But I very much agree that you come into this being very open and wanting to partner with people, wanting to partner with the committee on what we're doing. So we've all got to roll up our sleeves and figure out how we move forward. But I think this presentation was helpful for me also. To think, consider how we think about this, and how we kind of bite off chunks of it to be able to move forward. So thank you.
So I endorse a lot of what Joy said. I think this was very helpful, Bob, and it was also very good that after you spent some time here and reviewing things, that you have a high level of confidence in the team, and in particular in Dina, and that's wonderful to hear. I think this clarifies for me a lot of things. I think, and maybe I'm now encroaching on Dina's presentation, which comes next, but kind of flows from here. But it is the question, I guess, of at the beginning, Bob, you talked about, we need to identify the risks that are the most important to mitigate or to avoid. And I guess that's the process that we're going through now, that you're, and so, that's, I guess, because Bob kind of said, ultimately he thinks it's the Audit and Risk Management Committee that would have the responsibility for saying, or maybe saying, these are the most important risks. But I don't know whether, Bob, you have some thoughts on the process by which we should figure out what are those most important risks that we should address, or whether we should just turn it to Dina to have her describe what she's doing as part of her report.
Well, that would be a big part of her job, actually. That's a big part of her job, in my opinion.
And we are currently doing a compliance risk assessment to identify the existence. It's a very baseline benchmarking for the first phase to identify if internal controls exist for each of the business units. That's kind of the first step. And if they do, great, then they're a lower compliance risk initially. If they don't exist, they're a higher compliance risk initially, and we would work with those business units first. But then eventually, when there's staffing and we're able to delve into the documents received during the compliance risk assessment and evaluate those and identify not just does it exist, but what's in it. What does it look like? Is it a high risk? Is it something that we should be concerned about? Because if it exists, it's one thing, and that's great because it should exist in every business unit. But what does it say and what does it mean is a whole nother level, and that's going to take some time to be able to get in there and really look at that.
I don't see any more questions, and I think we are sort of entering into your presentation and update on the compliance program, so maybe we can move to that and you can tell us what you're doing in your own way rather than just respond to our questions, and if we have further questions.
Okay, well, and I did tailor my my brief status update based on Dr. Yetman's presentation because I knew that was an important part of the understanding of the difference between audits and compliance. So as I stated, over the last 3 months since November, we have been involved in a compliance risk assessment, making sure that we're identifying. We've come up with 31 specific functions, business functions, that we're evaluating for, including audits. Do you have a policy and procedure, if applicable? Do you have written procedures? And do you have a quality assurance function within your own business unit to kind of do your own checks and balance? So we're about 83% done with that assessment. We've done 26 of the 31. And so far, the majority of the business units are coming out a non-risk, a low risk, and maybe a handful of medium risks, no high risks yet at this point. So I think that's good to report. Another thing is just to emphasize that we are continuing to develop collaboratives with the different business units. We're working with audits, we're working with the Enterprise Risk Management Group, working with human resources, working with investments, for the very reason that Dr. Yetman mentioned, kind of informally doing the gang of three, and establishing those collaboratives, just to see how we can facilitate the enterprise compliance look that looks as like an umbrella over the individual compliance functions that are already happening. And in many of the business areas, it's already very robust, and they're doing a really good job. And then there are some they're probably have always been doing it, but they don't know they're doing it. And so it's just to maybe put pen to paper and document that. So I think I already mentioned we did a resource need projection, asking for staffing, which is 10 over the next 4 years. And we've actually met one-on-one with budgets to identify the best approach to get staffing as soon as possible. We also, one thing that's a best practice and critical to a successful compliance program is to have an anonymous hotline so that people feel comfortable and confident that they can report suspected compliance violations. And so we're working through an RFP process to identify a vendor and try to get that function on board. And just within the last couple of weeks, we've launched our sub-site on Central. So now people know we're here. We're in the phone book. And we actually have had 229 views. And I didn't do them all. It was not me. And within the site on Central, we're doing a monthly educational topic, kind of a topic of the month, to just let people know that we're here, the service that we offer, what's available, and let them know how we can help them, and just give them information about different compliance subjects. So that's just short and brief.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the committee?
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. And the 0.5 person that I've poached to help me, I just wanted to introduce Addison Embry. He's been a great help. He's not my staff, but he's been instrumental in assisting me. He's been very, very helpful and knowledgeable, and came with the same desire and drive to see the compliance program be successful that I have. So I just wanted to acknowledge you and thank you.
Michelle.
Just a super quick question on the compliance hotline and how that would differ from like a whistleblower hotline, just from an agency perspective. I'm just curious how, I mean, you kind of answered the second part of the question, which is how will an employee know which they should contact if they came in across something, but I'd be interested to hear.
Well, if you're speaking to the official whistleblower hotline, which is run by the state, it's different than that. It's on our internal, it's for internal customers and external customers, and it's for anyone who believes that a compliance violation or an ethics violation may have occurred or be occurring. So it's similar to a whistleblower hotline, but it's gonna have parameters that are identified very specific to a compliance violation. So not just, oh, I think my coworker is, I don't know. It's not sexual harassment kind of stuff. It's compliance violations with specific things.
If I could, Dina, just.
Thank you.
Actually, we have three sources of hotline complaints here. We have the traditional state auditor whistleblower that's available to everyone, and we advise them every July they can use that for employees. We have a pension abuse hotline that comes via our external website, and that's actively used for spiking and those kinds of things. And then we have a third internal source that it fits what Dean is talking about, except that most companies in the private sector use an external vendor to field those anonymous complaints from employees. We're really using our internal website, even though it is anonymous, and it goes really to the general counsel's office. If an employee were to use it, it's a best practice in the private sector to use an external party to field those. And so we're really talking about outsourcing an internal function right now to be more similar like what a business would use. I would say though, the pros and cons of those are, even though Dina accurately described its purpose, in reality, hotlines often pick up human resource complaints and other things like that. So our director of human resources also is available if those complaints we receive are more related to a sexual harassment case or anything that might come through that door. So we want to use all the doors ideally for different types of issues.
Right, and once we receive those, we will also be able to get dashboard reports and sort and filter the information and route it to the appropriate. If it's an HR related, we would definitely route it that way. Yes, it's a 800 number, toll-free number, is the best practice, and it will allow people anyone from outside, a member or a neighbor, anyone who thinks that there's something amiss, to be able to call that number and leave their information.
We have very, very few complaints that we've received on the line, but we investigate them if we have. And my example of a sexual harassment one was theoretical. We've not had any come through on the hotline in that manner, but it is topical, so I used it.
Dina, so thank you. So it sounds like you're making a lot of progress. 83% of the business units have been reviewed. That's wonderful, and it's also good to hear that the results are generally pretty good, or very good in most cases. I like Bob's suggestion that we hear from you at each meeting. So our next meeting, I think, is in May. Are we meeting in? Okay. Do you think you'll have completed all of the business units by then and can give us a report on your risk assessment?
We were really pushing. We were hoping it would be done by today,
Okay.
but I'm sure we'll have a completed assessment and the ability to provide you with
Okay.
the information, not only that we're 100% completed, but what the information looks like.
That would be wonderful.
Sure.
That would be great. And I don't want to put you on the spot right now, but what do you think of Bob's suggestion of a gang of 3 or something like that?
I vote for a different name.
It's taking on a life of its own, but okay, the steering committee will be very boring, I think.
No, I think it's a great idea. I think there is a lot of already existing knowledge within CalSTRS about compliance efforts. And again, my role isn't to create out of nothing a compliance program. It's to look at all the compliance efforts that are already underway, help them evaluate them, and look at it from an enterprise perspective. How are we doing overall in our compliance efforts? So I think it's a great idea.
Great. I don't see any more questions. I really appreciate all three of you really helping us to understand and clarify the role and the work of compliance. I think one of the things that is clear from what Bob said is the 3 lines of defense. There are different people with different responsibilities, but it only works if they are also all working together. And so I think it's a great guideline and makes me and I think the committee understand, Dina, where your responsibilities fit into that. And it sounds like in that context you're making great progress. I'm glad to hear that. And that you're getting assistance as well from others in the organization. And so that's also wonderful to hear, and we'll look forward to hearing from you in May about the risk assessment. So.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, moving right along, I think we're just about done. Review of information requests. Did we have any?
There were no information requests by the committee, Mr. Chair.
Great. And a draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Any comments on that? See none. Okay. Opportunity for statements from the public. Okay. Well, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.